Welcome to a Fireside Chat with Zany Mystic. I am your host, Lance White, also known as the Zany Mystic. Tonight's guest is Bruce Rawles. Bruce has studied geometry, pattern, and form to uncover its deeper implications and symbolism since the early 1970s. In 1992, after taking a workshop on sacred geometry by Greg Braden, Bruce fulfilled his dream and recorded sound and music in the Great Pyramid on an Egyptian tour led by Braden. Greg also had a catalytic effect of rekindling Bruce's enthusiasm for sacred geometry, which ultimately developed into the book Sacred Geometry Design Sourcebook. Bruce is working on his second book, The Geometry Code. So let's find out more about Bruce by welcoming him to the show now, I think.
Well, I'm here. Thanks, Lance. I appreciate you having me. When I got your email the other day, and your nom de plume was Zany Mystic, I thought, I've got to do this because I can definitely relate to Zany and definitely relate to Mystic. So anyway, I just immediate resonance with a kindred soul there. So.
Oh, good. Well,
yeah.
You know, when I read your writings, I got the same thing from you. There's such a playfulness about your exploration into the metaphysical realms that I just thought, this guy is terrific.
Well, thanks. I have a lot of fun with what I do, and to me, it seems like that's the whole point, is that if we take what appears to be, our material world too seriously, then we're, turning our backs on our mystical potential.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because all the great sages and visionaries, it seems like, from the ages have all been suggesting in one fashion or another that what appears around us is just a mirror or reflection of what's going on inside us, and one of the principles that we could talk about in these 7 Hermetic laws I've been writing about is the law of cause and effect, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with. But we forget to apply it sometimes. We get all caught up in the seeming world around us, which modern physics is telling us more and more all the time that is, like Einstein said, optical delusion of consciousness.
Yes.
So I think it's important to have a sense of humor about what appears to be our little action figure lives in the dream world.
Yeah, that's true. Speaking of action figures, do you feel that we're animated? I sometimes like the analogy that we're like puppets animated by a larger group of entities that are kind of playing around with us like they play with dice. Do you get into that at all about the idea of soul, spirit, and how that interrelates with geometry?
I think that we're all one, basically, and we've just gotten...
So, where are we, who are we, and what's going on in this world?
Well, that's the important question. One of the things that I was doing a couple of years ago that it may sound like a side excursion, but of course maybe our life in three-dimensional space-time is a side excursion. Maybe that's what we're talking about to a certain extent. Is that one of the things I've gotten wholeheartedly involved in again as a result of a couple of books that I read a year and a half ago by Gary Renard. I don't know if you've read Gary's work, but
I've read some of it.
I think pretty brilliant, and it kind of got me back into studying A Course in Miracles, which is really, I think, a very concentrated, distilled source of spiritual wisdom and insight about non-duality, which is, to me, is back to the oneness again. I mean, if we're all one being and space-time is just kind of a bogus thing that we've talked ourselves into, and the raft of problems that we seem to have, really, if our true reality is an eternal being, then the fleeting things that go by are nothing more than something to forgive, that don't really exist. And not that we don't need to, respond appropriately in our external lives, but like your mystical moniker suggests, that if we have an attitude of inner peace or inner ease that is able to kind of smile a little bit, and just maybe have a little Cheshire grin that says, okay, yes, I'm appear to be in this world, with moving this little action figure around that I call my human body. But what's really going on is in the greater context, we're one being expressing as many different individuals, and when we are able to forgive what appears to be differences, it frees us up to let go of the attachments and aversions that we have to the things that keep us trapped to what we would call negativity. So.
Well, it seems that if we really understood that at the deepest levels, that would be an instant end to wars and duality.
Exactly. And years ago, and up until pretty recently, I've been somewhat involved in like the Green movement and a lot of political activism and all that kind of stuff. But the more and more, and all that's great, and it's important work and needs to be done. And all the environmental causes and so forth, and all good stuff. And it also seems like the deeper work, and really on a more fundamental level, is the inner work of recognizing that there's no other. And or as one of the physicists in What the Bleep was saying, there's no out there.
Right.
And if there's no out there, then there's nothing to forgive, and then our forgiveness becomes easy because the exercise becomes one of saying, oh, well, this is as Einstein said, an optical delusion of consciousness, and I'm seeing out of the vast cosmos of things just this tiny little speck of space-time that we call Earth. And a little blip on the radar we call a physical life that, if we take good care of ourselves, maybe lasts 100 years.
Yeah.
And so putting that in perspective and having that deep serenity of that cosmic perspective that is grounded in everyday practice of letting go of the attachments and aversions to things that appear outside ourselves and directing our attention more inwardly, then that frees us up to have a lot more fun and enjoy what appears to be going on around us, and do that in work. So kind of getting back to geometry, and it's like, well, some of your listeners are like, well, what does this have to do with geometry? I guess what originally inspired me to look at geometry, back in the early 70s, was there was a couple of books. One that was called Secrets of the Great Pyramid, by Peter Tompkins. And there was a chapter in there on the golden ratio. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting because they encoded this proportion in the triangular faces of the Great Pyramid in Giza, Egypt. And that proportion is such that if you take the line that goes from the top of the pyramid, the apex, and goes down to the middle of each of the sides, that's called the apothem. It's the fancy mathematical term. And compare that proportion to 1/2 of the base sides, which that little line would then divide, you get this proportion called the golden ratio. And that ratio is about 1.618 to 1. And what's interesting is you find that not only in structures like the Great Pyramid and the face of the Parthenon, which a rectangle with those proportions would perfectly mesh over, and all kinds of Renaissance art, from Da Vinci to Raphael to even modern stuff. Our World United Nations building, for example, is 3 golden rectangles stacked on each other. So a lot of artists and architects and musicians, throughout centuries have recognized this proportion that has to do with harmony and balance and so forth. And that proportion I also discovered is in nature. And there's another book that my mother, who's been a spiritual mentor my whole life, I'm very grateful for. And my father, kind of symmetrically, kind of got me into the natural world and the beauty of being outdoors and so forth. And my mom was more of the networker and mystic type, and so those two influences kind of converged in this interesting life I appear to be living.
Wow, it sounds like a great combination.
Yeah, and my father was a supervisor on the cyclotron at Lawrence Livermore, and so I had conversations around the dinner table as a kid, things like isotopes and deuterium, and I realized years later that most kids probably didn't have those kind of words thrown around the dinner table.
Normal dinner conversation.
Exactly. But what got me into the sacred geometry, these two books, The Secrets of the Great Pyramid and This Living Earth by David Cavagnaro, and that it also had mention of this thing called the golden ratio. And I thought, well, what is this thing? And I discovered it was in the spiral patterns of the Fibonacci series proportions of daisy seeds and sunflower heads and the chambered nautilus. All kinds of places in nature. The population of drone bees could be mapped out with a Fibonacci sequence, which converges on this proportion at infinity. And it just goes on. And the cross-section of every DNA molecule in your body, or any what we call biological life, is a pentagon, which is a 5-pointed geometry. And that pentagonal geometry is just completely enmeshed in this golden ratio.
Huh.
So when the Pythagoreans and their so-called secret society, had the pentagram on their hands, and that was how they recognized each other. It's probably because, at least they didn't get burned at the stake that way, kind of thing for being mystics then. But the whole idea behind it, if we go a little further, is, well, what is so mystical about this proportion? Well, it turns out that that's the proportion where if you take a line that's a certain length and divide it in just such a way that the ratio of the large part to the small part is the same proportion as the whole to the large part. So now if you imagine that's basically if you take a 5-pointed star and just draw it on a piece of paper, those are the proportions of the pieces of that 5-pointed star. And it's also, interestingly enough, it's a number that turns out to that 1.618 ratio. So what it turns out to be is that's a ratio in such a way that there's this context or a relationship. And what is modern physics saying? That matter is really not so much more about substance, but more about relationship. That it's really the context, which is really the content of what we are, rather than the form. The subatomic particles really in the quantum realm are basically engaged in relating. And there's even this idea, well, maybe there's just one electron and it's just shared throughout the universe, kind of thing.
Yes.
So, but all this stuff ties together in this mystical understanding, which really I think is very pragmatic, because once we see that everything's interconnected, then it all boils down to the happy realization that we have the center point of an infinite circle or sphere within us with which to find our way out of the maze, out of the labyrinth, to the home that is that oneness. So anyway, to get back to this golden ratio, I when I went to school at UC Davis in California, that was about the time I really was getting fascinated with this golden ratio, and was starting to make all kinds of drawings, which eventually found their way into my Sacred Geometry Design source book. I'd done a whole bunch of these by hand, and finally migrated to the computer and was using CAD programs and that sort of thing. And then during this time, my mystical longing for wanting to know the deeper why of all this continued unabated. And I keep coming back to what's the underpinning behind all this? And that's what led me to looking at a book that I've been given a wonderful insight into back in the late 70s and early 80s called the Kabbalion. And there's these 7 Hermetic laws that start with the law of mentalism, that everything exists in mind, that all is mental, as it says. And the self-fulfilling prophecy is a perfect example of that. You give someone something to look at, and they're going to see what they want to see. And we've all done it, and we all know how that works.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know I'm mental. So I got the first one down pat.
Yeah. And even our bodies. I mean, ultimately, again, modern physiobiology is suggesting that, where do they really exist? If you disconnect the neuron flow, and the synaptic stuff, people who go in sensory deprivation who aren't aware of their body or in a dream or whatever, is like, well, where does the body exist when we're not thinking about it? Well, does it make a sound in the forest if there's nobody around? That kind of thing. So that we're kind of, so many different sciences and metasciences are converging on this understanding that we really are truly one being. And actually, there's a movie that I kind of, there's a lot of movies I like, but the one that Dustin Hoffman and Lily Tomlin were in. I'll think of the name of it in a second. I Heart Huckabees. It wasn't a great film, but there's one scene in it that was wonderful where Dustin Hoffman has this sheet, like a bed sheet, and he just to show the protagonist of the film who's asking. He's basically they're holographic. What do they call them? Something like that. Holographic detectives or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, the gist of it is the protagonist is trying to figure out why all these synchronicities keep happening to him, and Dustin Hoffman is explaining in this film. He says, well, we appear to be separate individuals, and then he takes the fingers of his hand and says, here's all these separate fingers. He says, but it's really one hand, And he says when you put the bed sheet over it, and the little things that poke up look like they're separate, but it's all one sheet. It's all one substance. And again, that's where modern physics is corroborating a lot of that. The so-called Copenhagen interpretation is one of those things that I think was a big aha, and the physicists like Einstein and Bohr and Schrödinger and Planck were all converging. 4 or 5 decades ago, I guess now, and apparently in Copenhagen, and they were all looking at each other when quantum mechanics was being birthed, and realized the implications of what they were discovering was really staggering, because the Newtonian view that everything was just a billiard ball universe, which is still valid in that context, but it was this is a very limited model and didn't account for the fact that there was this interconnectedness, and to tie it back into the law of mentalism, there's this principle that the observer influences the observation.
Right.
Okay, because the electron either behaved as a wave or a particle depending on the intention or the expectation of the observer. So, okay, and that experiment where it's been shown to be either a particle or a wave depending on the expectation of the observer has been replicated many, many times. And to me, the take-home lesson of that is that it's our expectation that determines the outcome of any experience in our lives. And we can either be upset at what appears to be going on around us in this little tiny speck of space-time, or we can kind of smile inwardly and say, okay, maybe this is another little lesson of unraveling the mystery and helping each other go home to that very sublimely, supremely, serenely beautiful feeling of oneness that is really our birthright, and where we've never left all along, ultimately. So,
I like that idea, and I kind of have a feeling that that's where we're headed, but I'm doing it kind of from a reverse, from a linear fashion, following some of the Mayan calendrical events and prophecies and so on that end in 2012. And so it's basically it's saying a similar thing, that we're one and we're moving in a time when there will be no time.
Right.
So, whatever that means, and since there is no time, then this is part of an illusion.
Yeah, I kind of think of the 2012 thing as perhaps, maybe this is sort of like a pivotal moment. Not that it's going to be slam dunk. Everything suddenly from that point forward is going to be, completely different. But I think you can kind of look at phases of your life where something gradually phased out and something gradually phased in, and there may be that 50% point where, take for example the last election. There's suddenly a shift in the awareness of what this country is about. I think it's sort of symbolic of that. Whether or not you politically are in tune with that idea, but there's definitely a shift that's happening. And if we look at the deeper significance of what's the idea of having someone who wants to integrate all perspectives as a commander-in-chief, a cabinet that has diverse points of view that recognizes the validity of all points of view, that's kind of a neat symbol or a metaphor of what's going on inside us, and that's where I keep wanting to bring it back. It's not the out there, and I think it's great that there are some wonderful, encouraging signs in the outer world. But if the outer world is nothing more than a reflection of what's going on inside us, then it can be a convenient distraction for doing the inner work of forgiving what appears in front of us moment to moment.
Yeah.
And so that's why I keep coming back to these hermetic principles, which then led me to some of the work of like Gary Renard and A Course in Miracles. But these hermetic laws, maybe I should just finish those up real quick, rather than leave the listeners hanging. The first of these 7 hermetic laws in the book called the Kybalion, not to be confused with the Kabbalah, but another equally interesting work. But the Kybalion was written about 100 years ago, and the first law was the law of mentalism, which we just talked about. The second was the law of correspondence, the as above, so below, as below, so above principle. And the law of correspondence, let me back up a little bit. And geometrically, I think there's some symbols that work beautifully with these 7 laws. The circle or the sphere and the center point of those, and imagining an infinitely large circle or sphere, and that's really our infinite nature. which is mind, because we can imagine anything, we can conceive of anything, we can instantly mentally be in another galaxy, even though our physical bodies might take quite a while to get there. We can imagine being there instantaneously. So mind really is truly infinite, and we are that, and we're more than that, and being essence. So a circle, I think, is a great metaphor for that, or sphere. Then correspondence, the as above, so below. If you think, okay, what happens when you take two circles or two spheres? Starting with two circles, if you have two circles of the same size and overlap them in such a way that the center of one is touched by the circumference of the other, or in other words, if symbolically or metaphorically we touch each other's heart, then we have this shape called the vesica piscis, which is no different than what's called the lens, which is also an interesting metaphor. If you think of an optical lens made of glass or whatever material, that shape, that cross-section, is the intersection of two circles is what brings light into a focal point. And so how do we see, and what is light? And if we're made of light, truly, then that's kind of a neat metaphor. And the mechanisms by which we communicate, again, relationship, are the eye, which is that shape. The mouth often has that vesical shape. And even the stomata of plants, the breathing orifices, if you will, of plants is a vesical shape. And then so many other examples in nature and art. A lot of Renaissance art depicts Christ and mystics in what's this called the areole or the vesica shape, which is this overlapping circles. So then we move to which is, again, all about relationship and the fact that if we are free in our appreciation of what appears to be other, then we reconcile the inner and the outer. So then we move on to the third law, which is the law of vibration, and that has to do with frequency and wavelengths and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, the vibratory rates that we tune into is the quality of feeling. And we don't have to, know the frequency in mathematical terms to know that when we're feeling at peace or in harmony with our inner being, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't things going on outside of us that we might want to have different, but if we're internally unruffled because we're doing the inner work of forgiving what appears to be, then the vibratory quality of our inner serenity can be a very transformative thing. So I think that might be the more the mystical meaning of vibration. And sure, it's great to surround ourselves in terms of our external environment with harmonious surroundings, and I've got friends that are all into feng shui and do great things with all that stuff. The color and sound, and I've dabbled with synthesizers and art and all kinds of stuff. And on my website, I've got some geometric art that's fun and it's all good stuff. But to me, the deeper significance of the law of vibration is what moment to moment are we feeling, and do we recognize that we have control of how we feel, which is, again, this spectrum of vibratory qualities that we have at our choice, moment to moment.
Do you feel that we have the capability of vibrating at different elements or octaves of vibration within us?
Oh, of course.
Now, we're in the third dimension or third density, basically. I guess that's what this is. We call this realm the third dimension. But isn't it possible that we're also vibrating in ways that we're unaware of or cannot see with our...
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the metaphors I really like, and I was just sharing with a friend on a hike today. I live in Southern Oregon. It was a gorgeous day. We went out, had a long hike on a sunny day, and she and I were talking about the metaphor of the flatlanders. And
tell that, would you?
Oh, well, I think it's such a cool metaphor because if you imagine, let's say you've got two-dimensional critters that live in a flatland, like a piece of paper, and they're trapped in two dimensions. If some of us in 3D wanted to have a little, innocent, practical, fun joke, at their expense, if we poked a pencil through their so-called reality, one of these 2D flatlanders might say, "Oh my gosh, I'm seeing a little black dot," and then the next thing, "Oh my God, I'm hallucinating it even more because now it's turned into a larger brown circle, and oh look, now it's turned into a yellow hexagon." And then as we poke the pencil through it, you know, and then they think I should call National Enquirer for Flatland, right? And then pretty soon it turns into a pink circle and then disappears, and they think, oh my God, you know, call the shrink, you know. But you know, all the what we call paranormal, and we have such a tiny window.
Oh yeah.
I mean, talking back to the law of vibration again, and we have, you know, we see 1 octave of electromagnetic energy out of presumably an infinite number. I mean, there's at least 50 or so octaves of electromagnetic energy that we can measure from the low radio spectrum up through infrared, the visible light that we see, ultraviolet, X-rays and cosmic rays, and out the other side. You know, that's just one little, you know, chunk of the possible experience that could be perceived even in the external realm. And then, likewise, the sound, we hear 10 octaves out of pressure waves, out of probably an infinite number of octaves there. And then we, you know, again, we were talking about earlier about the, you know, the little speck that our lives represent in space-time.
Yeah.
You know, maybe 100 years, you know, if we take good care of ourselves and, you know, we occupy 6 feet or so out of how many light years, yeah? So necessarily we have a pretty abridged perspective.
Yeah.
And to think that we have any kind of insight is ludicrous, you know. I mean, so that's why I think we need to, you know, tune into our transpersonal self, where instead of relying on just our own limited sense, we you know, tune into the wisdom of the sages that have gone before us and the mystics that have transcended the illusion by forgiving what appears to be and saying, okay, I know there's something better here, and I need your help because I'm not going to do this alone. And get, you know, tying into the relationship thing of the law of correspondence, and you know, tuning into the vibration, the law of vibration, and then that leads to the next one, the law of polarity, which is the 4th of the Hermetic laws. And that 4th law basically says that everything has its opposites, duals, you know, positive and negative, yin and yang, hot and cold, dark and light, all the polarities that we can think of. And again, we can use the thought system that says that we're all one, that transpersonal awareness, to take anything that appears to be polarized and recognize the intrinsic unity. One of the sections in A Course in Miracles I really like is called Above the Battleground, and I've just been having a conversation with some friends about that. So a shout out to all my friends in the local study groups. We've got some dear friends that we have these great conversations, and the idea of being above the battleground is sort of if you think of the triangle is a good metaphor for that, because you can have 2 points on a line that appear to be opposite sides of an issue or a value or polarity or whatever, and there's this third point that is above that, kind of like the apex of the pyramid, if you will, if you're looking at a 2-dimensional analogy, and that capstone or that third perspective is that transcends the other two is the one that says, hey, it's really just 2 aspects of the same thing.
Yeah.
That all polarities are really the same but just different in degree. Right. And that's the Hermetic principle that brings us to a point of resolution to say all that we appear to see as duality is basically used by the ego perspective a way to get us further away from the truth of what we are. Yeah. Whereas used by a transpersonal awareness, it can be a tool moment to moment to say, okay, what does this conflict really mean? Does it mean that there's really something out there to be upset about? Or could it be an opportunity to say, aha, here's a signpost that can allow me to be more at peace by saying this is really nothing more than 2 aspects of the same thing. Uh-huh. And we are that same thing, that same infinite being. So there's the fourth law. The 5th law, again, these are all basically ways of looking at duality and saying, do we want to bring it back to unity or do we want to split it farther apart? The 5th law being the law of rhythm. And, of course, there's countless examples of that in our lives in every sensory realm as well as every inner realm. Uh-huh. And following our inner rhythms and following our inner guidance moment to moment is a way of kind of going with the flow, if you will. And one of the things I was studying a couple of years ago when I was doing consulting for the Air Force and talking about process improvement with some folks at an Air Force base in Washington, flying back and forth there every week. And the idea there was, well, look at what they call the 5 whys, and looking at process improvement from even a very pragmatic standpoint of, you know, how can we save taxpayers' dollars in millions or even billions by looking at the waste that happens by not looking at the flow. And Toyota has pioneered a lot of this stuff, and they have this thing called the 5 whys, and they look at, well, okay, why do we do things this way? And then they say, okay, well, now that you've answered that, ask it on a deeper level. Okay, well, why are we doing that? And then why are we doing that? And so if we keep asking, to me it's a very mystical question. And then, but if you get down to the ultimate why, it's really to get back to that connection with all that is, that we can call it Creator, God, whatever we call it, but that recognition that we've never left Source.
Yes.
And so following the inner rhythms can either lead us meandering away from that awareness of oneness, or it can lead us back to it, depending on the thought system that we choose to apply to it.
Yeah, definitely.
So then there's 2 more, and then I'll take a breath. How are we doing at time? Okay, good.
We're fine.
Oh, good. So the next one of these 7 laws is called the law of cause and effect, which we kind of touched on briefly at the beginning of the hour. And that, to me, this is such a pivotal idea that we are cause, that our thoughts, our feelings, what goes on in our minds is cause, and what transpires outside of us that we get so hung up on is effect.
Yeah.
And we spend seemingly most of our lives chasing after one kind of effect or another, whether it's a relationship or the house that we want, or the finances, or the state of health, or all those kind of things.
Yep.
And they're all worthy, of course, to, things to be happy and wonderful in the outside world. But they're all effect. And if we start with that, we're always, putting the cart before the horse instead of the heart before the course.
Very good.
So the idea then is that we're cause, and we have control of our thoughts and feelings, whereas we don't necessarily have any say in what's going on outside of us, or in what appear to be other people's thoughts and feelings. But that's perfect, because that's all we need to have charge of.
Yeah.
And
that's quite an accomplishment to do that.
Well, it is. But that's really our true life work, is recognizing our responsibility to choose how we feel about what's going on around us, moment to moment.
Yeah.
And if we can do that, then we will join the ranks of the successful mystics who've gone before us, who have said, okay. Yeah, and again, it's a very zany thing to do, because it's basically saying, and I love your your zany mystic phrase, because that's such a perfect combination of words, because it does seem zany from the world's perspective to say, I don't care about making the world my first priority. I'm making the cause of the world my first priority.
Exactly.
That's
it.
As you well know. And then the last one of the 7 laws is the law of gender generation. And this has to do with the feeling-thought combination, or the masculine, feminine, yin-yang, whatever we want to call it. And the balance between those two is really what is truly creative. And who we are on an eternal basis is infinitely creative, infinitely extending, and has nothing to do with the lives that we appear to be living in the material world.
Yeah.
And I think that is the inner longing, that inner balance, the feeling that calls us to a greater understanding of ourselves and each other as one and not separate, but also that the love and the serenity, the qualities of just unshakable peace that we're looking for don't exist outside ourselves. Right. And they can be mirrored in externals, and that's very commonly the case when we follow that guidance. But they don't necessarily show up in external terms in any given moment, because the machine of the universe is set in motion with so many infinite variables of cause and effect that if we can again get caught up in the externals, then we're forever going to be chasing something that is a moving target.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Whereas
lost in a sea of troubles.
Yeah. So having talked a little bit about the geometry, I'll go back and kind of review some of the geometric metaphors that I think fit very nicely with these. So the first law, the law of mentalism, you have the circle. The second law, the 2 overlapping circles for correspondence, the as above, so below. The law of vibration, the sine wave, and that whole, again, the parallel waves that make up the laser beam, that focus of attention is such a great metaphor for the single-mindedness of being true to our inner guidance and the feeling of the vibrations that we choose to tune into. The law of polarity, again, a triangle is a good metaphor, and then you can also think of like a zodiac of 4 different triangles, and each of them bring together, if we go in an outer direction toward more polarization, we can think of all the differences, or we can look at both inwardly and outwardly, and this works great in social and organizational work. If we look at, and in our families and our friends and any situation we find ourselves in, if we look at what are the things that bring us together, how do we minimize what appear to be the threats so that we recognize our common ground, then we're using the law of polarity in perhaps you could say a geometrical way to bring back to the center to where there's a balance between points rather than out to the periphery. The law of rhythm, a spiral is a perfect metaphor because we can either spiral in or spiral out toward the center. And then for the law of cause and effect, I think a wonderful geometric metaphor would be a fractal of any kind. A tree, I think, is a good example. You can think of the one root of the tree branching into many branches and even more smaller branches and so forth and so on.
And infinitely.
Yeah, and then it's a mirror above and below, again. It's all these laws tied into each other.
Yeah.
So the root structure is like a mirror of the branch structure, just underground, and so we have this balanced fractal of all the infinite number of causes feeding into this one moment, which could be symbolized by the present, which then branches out into an infinite number of potential futures in the effect realm. So, and we're, again, it's always, to kind of use Eckhart Tolle's ideas, it's always the now, because that's the only thing we really have.
Right.
And that's, the now exists in eternity, and everything else is, again, this optical hallucination kind of thing. And then the law of gender, I think the yin-yang is such a great symbol, and you can make a fractal out of that. If you take that symbol and then overlay it over the 2 halves of the circle, and you quickly realize that it's a fractal, and that kind of ties into the whole genetic thing that, we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and if you keep carrying that back, we have an infinite number of ancestors, and I've never figured that one out, have you?
No.
So, wait, how did we get here if we had to have, how many billions of people needed to be on the planet so many years ago for us to be here? It's like, something isn't adding up. But anyway, that's another fun excursion aside. But
well, I think we might have had some outside help along the way.
Yeah. So some little genetic seeding, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe some star nations, some ET brothers and sisters and friends.
There's a lot of evidence that suggests that we're not alone in the universe.
Yeah.
And it would be kind of the height of arrogance to assume that, this little speck, third planet from a backwater solar system in a typical galaxy is it,
Well, I like in Contact how Ellie's father says it would be an awful shame if we were the only ones.
Oh, wouldn't it? Yeah.
And that was a great movie.
Yeah. And there was a little bit of geometric in there, too.
Well,
symbolism. Wasn't that the dodecahedron that they were spinning around into?
That's right.
Yeah. I catch those things. What can I say? Yeah.
And,
but I think it's really important to, and at the risk of sounding heretical to some of my fellow geometry buffs, the form ultimately isn't that important. And having said that, I think it's a lot of fun, and I've spent years and years looking at the not only the symbolism, but kind of the deeper underpinnings of what these geometries might mean. And the more I come across it, it's really the meaning that we ascribe to it. And that kind of ties into one of the early Course in Miracles lessons is, everything I see has the meaning that I ascribe to it, which ties into the law of mentalism beautifully. That it's our orientation and the thought system that we use moment to moment that it either guides us toward a state of peace or away from it. Yeah.
Well, now, one thing that I'm not sure that that I understand very well is what is the difference between normal geometry that's used, in mathematical calculations and sacred geometry? What distinguishes the two?
I think it's an attitude.
Oh, okay.
That'd be my off-the-cuff.
Divine geometry has a little bit of an attitude.
Well, it's really the mystical perspective of saying, is there something deeper rather than just trying to I mean, a lot of the original computers were designed to make the launching and firing of missiles and so forth more accurate. It's like, okay, just like you can use a hammer to either build a house or destroy one.
Right.
You can use electronics to create a war or make a new iPhone app that brings a smile to people's faces, or whatever. It's all the intention or the motivation behind it. So to me, sacred geometry is nothing more than saying I'm using my mystical awareness to bring to bear on this one discipline we call geometry, to notice that, oh, by the way, yes, we can use the interpretation of that transpersonal awareness to bring us back to an understanding that we've never left source, that we're all one, and grievances are basically a waste of time because they're a distortion in our perception that needs some kind of healing.
Yes, it seems that almost everything that goes on in the world is distortion at this point.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, we see such a tiny speck of space-time that it's from the get-go.
Yeah.
Anything that has to do with space-time, our senses, or duality is going to be a distortion of one kind or another. So, I mean, it's laughable, and I think that's where the zany comes in.
We almost have to laugh because we're like masters of limitations.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But there's that feeling, that underlying feeling, that we know that we're more than that. I mean, have you ever just kind of stood and looked in the mirror and you say, "You got to be kidding"? I'm this infinite spirit, and I'm going to assume that I'm trapped in this getup.
Right. This skin bag.
And lately, one of the things in A Course in Miracles I really like is there's a section called "The Hero of the Dream," and it's talking about how ludicrous it is to think that that our little physical lives, and granted, it's fine to do what we think we need to do.
Yeah.
And enjoy the things that we have, and it also says, why. There's no point in trying to deprive you of what little you think you have. But the idea is to say, wait a minute, been there, done that. Okay, how many lifetimes have we lived? Whether or not you believe in reincarnation, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
That we've been chasing after effect and trying to, make that our big thing. And at some point, we're going to get tired of that and say, wait a minute, there's something a whole lot more fun and enjoyable that is the happier dream of waking up to the illusion with that transpersonal guidance there's really, I think it's the collective again, that using the law of correspondence, that if we tune into each other and realize that the combined wisdom, or if you want to call it mastermind group, or the advisory council principle, or the understanding that we can draw on through inspiration, those that we admire the qualities of, and that's the beauty of sharing truth is it doesn't diminish by sharing. If we're mental beings, then anything that we share increases not only the so-called recipient, but the so-called giver. Whereas in the physical realm, when you give somebody something, we think that some part of the universe had an asset and a liability in those two columns kind of thing, right? Whereas, in the mental realm, you increase ideas universally by sharing them. So they're just extended. So I think that's the beauty of recognizing that we're mental beings, is that when we can maintain an inner Cheshire grin and realize that the joys that we experience are never lost because that's the eternal part of who we are, then we can begin to, by practice and repetition, it can be a good thing. Whatever technique works for you to let go of the grievances and the misperceptions that we have about each other and the world of, X did this to me kind of thing.
The victim mentality.
Yeah, and there's years ago, my wife and I started this thing called New Frontiers, the Gold Country, and we had a series of speakers once a month that came to the Northern California area that we lived in, and there's a lady who gave a talk called Life as a Waking Dream. And I actually wasn't able to make that one of those few talks I didn't make, but I saw the videotape of it afterwards. And one of the things she was saying was that, we can use the idea of dream interpretation and apply it to our so-called waking lives. And I thought, well, what a cool idea. because that means that we can look for the metaphors of what people represent to us.
Yes.
And if each of us is, if you're talking to me and vice versa, and all the people that are listening, we're metaphors for each other of a certain quality of thinking or feeling, and to the degree that we resonate with each other's ideas, we're strengthening or not those ideas.
Yeah.
So that can be a really powerful tool, and look at what's happened in our world in the last century as a result of mass communications, and in the last decade, and see how it's accelerating. To kind of get back to this 2012 thing a little bit, and the sort of the pivotal nature of the times we're living in, and not to make a big deal of that, because I think the awakening could happen at any time, and there's plenty of people that we've got evidence that have woken up from the dream, so to speak, in centuries past, and even whole cultures that may have just said, I think we are done with this and we can move on.
Yes, that's a whole new paradigm.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder if it might not turn out like that.
Yeah.
Do you see a lot of people awakening on an individual level, or in your travels and things?
Well, again, that gets back to that whole thing of, what is an individual?
Well,
I know. Maybe I'm getting a little too mystical, but
go ahead.
Well, why not? This is a mystical show, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So if we think, okay, well, what is an individual? Tying back to that metaphor idea, it's like, okay, if there's somebody who's like a saint or mystic who I think has woken up, and that's a part of me.
Yeah.
Then I think it puts the responsibility back on ourselves rather than looking outside, in the rearview mirror, so to speak.
Yeah.
It brings us back to, okay, what is my responsibility now?
Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with studying people who've had great insights and epiphanies and so forth, or doing the things that we need to do in the external world, and it doesn't excuse us from all of our mundane responsibilities. But I think we can do it with more of a joyous attitude and have fun with it and not take it so seriously. And one of the things that I really like in the Gary Renard's writings, he wrote a book called The Disappearance of the Universe, and the sequel, Your Immortal Reality. I'm going to go to a conference he's at in San Francisco at the end of this month, and get to see him again, along with a bunch of other people that are studying the Course in Miracles. And one of the things that really I think is a key, pivotal, mystical idea, if you will, is that unconsciously, if we think that we are separate individual beings, then there's this unconscious guilt that runs through our actions. And, we can go through all kinds of analysis and all kinds of stuff, but it's actually much simpler than that to whittle away at that or dissolve it, And that is by moment-to-moment forgiving ourselves or relieving ourselves from the necessity of judging and holding on to grievances and anxieties and attachments and aversions about things.
Yeah.
If we can just say, okay, I really don't have enough data from my little space-time dot in the cosmos perspective to judge this thing rightly. So I'm going to turn it over to the infinite mind awareness that does, which is our true nature, our one truly individual nature as one being.
Yeah.
Not the little separate bodies that we see action figures moving around day to day.
Yeah.
But if that one being really is who we are, then that can bring us that peace that says, okay, here's another opportunity for forgiveness. In fact, I had a T-shirt made up. One of my other websites is called ACIM blog for A Course in Miracles blog, and I put a little T-shirt on there and having fun with that. It's an acronym from one of Gary Renard's books that says every experience in our life is just another forgiveness opportunity, or JFO for short. So I got a big planet. Picture of the planet in space with big letters JFO over it, just another forgiveness opportunity.
Wow.
Because really, I think that where the rubber meets the road mystical insight is that if we practice moment-to-moment forgiving, that's our real spiritual work. That's our real, our life purpose is finding the peace that the Creator wants for us and going home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any theories or thoughts or feelings or any ideas about what might happen to us when we cross over?
Well, are you talking about 2012, or are you talking about going beyond bodies?
Yeah, when we leave these bodies.
Yeah. Well, to me, I think it's sort of like when a kid puts down a doll or a puppet.
Yeah.
You know? We're so accustomed from day one to making a big deal about our bodies.
Oh, my God.
I mean, think about how much time in a typical day is devoted to either care and feeding of our little vehicles that we hang out in. Or in one fashion or another, it's, clothing, housing, transportation, all the things that move our bodies around, make them comfortable and happy and
shopping.
all the stuff that we do. I mean, that's 99% of our lives. So, I mean, if we can just have a moment here and there when we have these little bursts of lucidity to say, okay, maybe, just maybe, my bodily existence is not all there is. Which to me is like the quintessential mystical impulse. Then perhaps, and it doesn't have to take too many lifetimes, we can get to the point where we gracefully let go of that and say, okay, I'm ready to go home. And but we can be a happy journey or a happy dream. We don't have to be shaken out of the nightmare, and panic mode. We can just say, okay, moment by moment, just, relieve ourselves of the need to have a white-knuckle grip on what we think is reality.
Well, it seems like that happiness also is part of the process of learning how to give to others as opposed to take.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I see those that are in power and control that are trying to shape everything in a certain direction. They don't seem to be very happy people.
Well, again, that's that paradigm. It's the thought system. Is it one of personal or transpersonal?
Right.
And the personal paradigm is really what is under attack. Yeah. Because that's the only thing that can be attacked, because it's the only thing that's not real.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it. Yeah. Because who we are, if we're transpersonal beings, if we're one being, then
we're all
then we're all
mirrors and aspects of each other.
Exactly. And to try to take from a part of ourselves is like ludicrous.
Right.
And one of my favorite authors, Richard Bach, wrote this classic thing, Jonathan Seagull, where he talks about realizing, wait a minute, this is stupid. What am I slogging around these fishing boats, and trying to get old stale fish, and then he says he deliberately dropped I think if I remember it, an anchovy to a hungry old gull chasing him. It's like, this is nuts. What the heck am I doing this for? And it doesn't mean that we, give up any material pursuits. It's just like, okay, well, maybe that's secondary. Just maybe we can have a little smile and say, yes, I'm doing all the normal things I do. You don't have to, go off the deep end and be totally externally radical. It's not about external radicality. It's about internal radicality. And
that changes everything.
It does, and that's what's so exciting is that by being an internal, nonconformist or radical, or truly a mystic, I think is the best term, and I love that term because it really hints at the fact that there is the revelation of the mystery is within us.
Yeah,
and there's nothing outside. Years ago, when I was looking at the words, I love wordplay, and my wife, who I love dearly, has a certain tolerance for puns, and we joke about this. But she's actually a better punster than I am, but she just won't admit it. But that's an aside. But anyway, I was playing with the idea of, well, what's a vicarious experience? And so I looked up vicarious in the dictionary, and it's the same word as vicar, which is like another word for pope or a religious intermediary, if you will. So it's kind of interesting. If we want to have somebody else's experience, you can go through that route, or you can have a direct experience. And it seems like what we're really after is a direct experience of that serenity, that peace, that understanding. That
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
and it's available to us moment to moment.
We're going to be running out of time.
Oh, yes, I guess so.
So fast. You have been just wonderful.
Oh, thanks. I really enjoyed this hour. It has whizzed by.
I want you to tell us all of your websites.
All of them?
You have a lot of
How about a few main ones? I'm working on several, and the main one, though, for people that want to see what I've done in terms of geometry and the Hermetic laws is geometrycode.com.
Okay.
And it's always like everything else, a work in progress. But there's I've got a book and I've got art on there, and people that do video editing. I've even got some geometric white patterns and a bunch of fun stuff. So anyway, you might enjoy a lot of that, and everything from T-shirts to cards to you name it. And then my blog, which is way overdue for an update. In fact, I'm planning to do that very shortly, is to kind of go to the new WordPress revolution theme I've got going. Is brucerawles.com, and the last name is Rawles. And a ton of stuff there. Just different musings and things, everything from music and art to movies and fun places, and just things that ultimately I think have a little mystical thread running through them that reminds us that we're all expressions of one infinite being, and seemingly expressing in a diversity of form. But anyway.
And you have another book coming out, yes?
Yeah. It's called The Geometry Code, and I've actually put a series of articles about these Hermetic laws that we touched on briefly on Drumbelow's e-zine site, which is called The Spirit of Mott. And there's links to that on the Geometry Code. If you go to the resources page or also my events page, I've got a list of those different articles. I just finished up the last one of the 7 laws, and there was kind of an introductory article on how that modern physics really is kind of leading us back to the metaphysics.
Well, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, Bruce, you have been fantastic.
Oh, Lance, I've had such fun. I always enjoy this kind of thing, so
it's
always a privilege.
Hope we can do this again.
Oh, I look forward to that. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
And good night, Bruce, and good night, everybody.
Yeah, thanks to all the people listening, and thanks, Lance, again for sharing this hour with me and everyone.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Take care.